So, in today's video, we're going to be talking about resource states, and in particular, our relationship to resource states. And we'll be looking at a couple key resource states that I think are kind of good markers to see where we're at in our progression and our healing journey. So, this video is really for anyone out there who perhaps struggles with a low level of functioning. That might include a lot of kind of coping behaviors that include a lot of pleasure seeking or dopamine seeking, this kind of thing. And you know you want to feel good, you know you want to feel better, but you perhaps don't know exactly what that means or what that looks like or what the role of pleasure seeking is in a healthy, integrated, fully embodied, spiritually awakened human being. So, if that interests you, and I really hope it does, because this is an important part of understanding our progression and our healing path, please join me. So let's just dive in with a quick definition of what a resource state is for anyone who's new to the channel, not familiar with this particular piece of psycho jargon. Let me just define this for you really quickly. So a resource state is essentially any state that we might access that, let's say, expands our capacity or helps us to be well resourced when it comes to some sort of challenge or adversity or problem. So, common resource states are generally positive emotional states or useful states, right? So, this might be something like joy, compassion, passion, aliveness, playfulness, easiness, well being, trust. These are all common resource states. Another obvious example here would be that if you are someone who's prone to anger and losing your temper, patience would be a resource state in a situation like that. So, resource states are generally going to be positive emotional states, peak experiences, capacities that our nervous system has to feel good, to feel strengthened, to feel enlivened, or anything that kind of helps to bolster or buffer or empower or support you when things get a little challenging for you. So, I hope that makes sense. I know I'm kind of talking in circles here, but basically, resource states are generally positive states that are useful. Okay, so hopefully that's clear enough. So let's look at some of our relationship to resource states. And first, I want to start off by just describing a basic dynamic in relationship to resource states. Then we'll look at a few key resource states that we want to kind of use as metrics to, where we are in our progress and our healing. So let's talk about it. As part of my work as a coach, I often am working with people around their relationship to different aspects of life. And broadly speaking, one of my major roles as a coach and as a hypnotherapist is to help people connect with resource states inside of themselves. This is a huge part of what healing is and a huge part of what I do. So, the reason I'm talking about this today is it recently came up in a session I was doing with a client where we were discussing this client's relationship to certain resource states and how they felt about their ability to access this resource or not, and what happened to their perspective on life when they were in the resource versus when they were not resourced. And it got me thinking about just how important it is to start to describe some of the relationship to resource states. So, a lot of times, in different forms of therapy or coaching work or whatever, when you hear people talking about resources, they don't get into our relationship to particular resource states. It's usually just resource yourself is kind of the message there. And while generally that's kind of what we want, what we want to be doing, I thought it'd be really useful to look at some of the different ways that we can find ourselves in relationship to resource states, if that makes sense. So the major dynamic I want to point out here is, and this is just really broad, this is really just general, is looking at when it comes to resource states or a particular resource state that perhaps you value or that you care about. Where do you fall in the spectrum of reaching for that resource, kind of feeling disconnected from it and longing for it or reaching for it, versus feeling embodied within that resource and expressing from that resource, right? So we could look at it like a spectrum of when we're very unresourced, we are reaching for the resource, we are longing, we are kind of hungry, we're grasping for the resource, right? And when we are fully resourced, we generally know it as a part of our being, and we are flowing that resource outward from our core nature, if you want to think of it that way. And so I want to just kind of start with that, get you thinking about where are you in relationship to resources? Are you more on that longing, reaching, desiring side of things, or are you more on that accessing, embodying, feeling side of things? And the reason I'm bringing this up is just to get you to start to think about what this progression looks like. And I'll give a little bit of a context here from my own life. I remember a period of time where I was using psychedelics a lot. And I would eat psychedelics and I was kind of using them to meditate and pray a lot. I was doing a lot of spiritual practice on psychedelics. And I would find myself often praying in a longing way, reaching for the resource, yearning, kind of bargaining almost with spirit, asking God for certain resources that I felt disconnected from. And I think when we're in that state, and I think this is a very common state for a lot of us, it's very easy for us to end up kind of hypnotizing ourselves or conditioning ourselves into viewing ourselves and creating a self concept really of separation from a resource. So I am disconnected from whatever this thing is, right? And I would encourage you to dehabituate from that if you find yourself there and start to look at how you can access and move along the spectrum into embodying and flowing from that resource state. In other words, becoming resourced. So I want to just start by defining this. And then I want to show you a graphic here in a moment of 3 different resource states and how I've started to think about it based on what I've been learning here, especially when it comes to secure self-relating and attachment work and all the stuff I'm talking about. How does this fit with resource and resourcing and resource states? So let me show you a graphic and we'll unpack this. And this will all start to make a little more sense if this seems a little vague right now. In this graphic, on the left-hand side here, you will see that we have kind of a spectrum, kind of from bottom to top of unresourced to resourced. And I kind of did this gradient from gray being kind of darker and kind of symbolically murky or heavier to white at the top being a bit more bright, vibrant, alive. And that's just kind of a loose metaphor of, feeling unresourced or disconnected or feeling resourced and connected. I don't know why these little segments are here in the spectrum. That's just the way the graphic came. So apologies, that doesn't mean anything in particular. And then we have this kind of Venn diagram here, this little vesica Pisces shape of these 2 overlapping circles. And at the lower end, so we have pleasure at the lower end, the orange circle. And then we have this overlap here where we have nourishment. And then we have this kind of purple circle above, which is positivity. So roughly speaking, we can kind of look at this and look at the spectrum to the left and kind of see a correlation here where pleasure tends to correlate more with feeling unresourced. And when we are more resourced, that tends to correlate more with feelings of positivity. Now, this is really what I want to discuss from a few different angles here and a few different perspectives. So the first thing I want you to consider is that for most people, where most people are at is when we feel disconnected, when we feel unresourced, we tend to reach for pleasure, right? We tend to reach for things that are pleasurable as a way of resourcing ourselves. So I don't think hedonism and pleasure seeking is inherently evil or wrong or bad or unconscious or pick whatever kind of judgmental language you want to put on top of that. I don't think it's necessarily bad at all. But I do think it is kind of the lower hanging fruit for our nervous system when we're feeling disconnected and unresourced. And therefore, we tend to want to reach for it first. And what I want to show you here is I think that a lot of times what we really need, and this is again what secure relating and secure self-relating does and self-regulation does, what we really need when we're feeling unresourced is nourishment. And in particular, what I mean here, sometimes that means physical nourishment. That means, nourishing your body with rest and sleep and good food and good exercise. But also, I mean, more fundamentally, we need relational nourishment and psycho-spiritual nourishment. We need that sense of our cup is filled up with connectedness, right? And this is, again, exactly what I'm teaching in the Secure Self-Relating course is how to nourish yourself. And you'll notice that nourishment is this kind of overlap point between pleasure and positivity, right? So when we are nourished, we tend to feel feelings of pleasure. So there's an overlap between pleasure and nourishment. And yes, there are certain forms of pleasure that if you just go directly for pleasure can leave you with feeling nourished as well. But obviously, there's also a bunch of pleasurable activities out there that leave you feeling kind of malnourished or undernourished, right? So for an obvious example here, and this is a good metaphor too, would be consuming, sweets and candy, right? So when we eat candy, there's pleasure involved, but it's not really nourishing, generally speaking, right? It's filled with all kinds of weird toxic additives and food colorings, and is generally like way too much sugar for our body to process. And so, yes, it's pleasurable, but it is not nourishing, right? And I think that this could be said for a lot of things online on the internet. So whether that's porn, or whether that's gaming, or whether that's going down some rabbit hole of some topic that you're fascinated by, or what doom scrolling. All of these things can have a certain element of pleasure to them, but they're not necessarily nourishing, if that makes sense. And I think this is, again, where most people who feel unresourced, this is where we go. We tend to go towards pleasure when what we really generally want and need, although we don't know how to identify it exactly, is nourishment. Nourishment, again, can generate feelings of pleasure. So I'm kind of recapping here so far. Can generate feelings of pleasure, and pleasure can kind of lead to nourishment a little bit with the right kind of pleasure. For example, eating a piece of delicious fruit could be pleasurable and nourishing, right? So there is overlap there. And this is where we get confused. But I think a lot of us are confused, and we think that pleasure and hedonism and pursuing pleasurable things will lead to feelings of nourishment and feeling more resourced. And this is kind of the hedonic illusion, is that we're chasing pleasure when what we really want is to be more resourced and more nourished, more psychospiritually nourished, right? So the first thing we can do is pursue nourishment, which does provide some pleasure, but it resources us too. And what I would say is that as we move further into a feeling and an accessing of being resourced, of deeply well resourced, we end up feeling as a general kind of tone to our nervous system, a general underlying feeling of positivity, right? So another way of looking at this, going back to that point I was just making in the earlier section of, are you reaching for the resource or are you expressing from it? Generally, pleasure is about reaching towards the resource, right? I mean, you can express pleasure, you can embody pleasure and give pleasure, and that can be coming from a resource. That can be an expression of a resource, absolutely. So this isn't a hard line, but as a general trend, for let's say a lot of people in our modern society, our relationship to pleasure is more about seeking a resource than expressing it. There are exceptions, but broadly speaking, as we get more resourced, we move into positivity. And generally, in positivity, we are expressing from a feeling of positivity. So we have the resource and it's internalized and accessed. And we are expressing from it as a mood, as a mode, as a mindset, and a worldview that is positive. And I think this is really what a lot of us are seeking, and what we want to feel is so deeply resourced that our life experience is one of positivity. That feeling of it's all good, you feel confident, you feel, easy, you feel flowing, you feel optimistic, you feel courageous, you feel curious, you feel open, you feel loving and affirming towards life, right? Positivity. And let me be clear here also, in the same way that pleasure can come from a resource rather than be reaching towards it, there are also people out there who, correctly identify that positivity is a high resourced, way of being, and they may feel unresourced. And the bias that they create, the illusion they create, is reaching towards positivity, right? So these are people who can tend to be kind of spiritual bypassers a bit. When you see these kinds of new age folks who, try to project this, oh, it's all good, it's all, it's all love, it's all light, it's all, what they're trying to do is they're reaching towards positivity often, right? They're not expressing from, because often when a person is deeply resourced and embodying positivity, sure, they may say those things, but it comes from a very different place of feeling very grounded in their being. They actually don't need to assert it usually. Usually when you're really feeling positive, it's that spring in your step. It's that easiness in the way you think, or that compassion and that caringness that you just bring to every interaction. It's not something you have to assert and kind of demonstrate and virtue signal around. It's something that is in you, right? So sure, you may want to share it. You may want to kind of lift other people up and brighten their day as well. That's a very different thing from trying to kind of over signal positivity, which I think is again a covert kind of way of reaching for that, or saying, hey, I value this and I know that this is what it is to be resourced. So just to recap here. So this is, these are not the only resource states, and these are not necessarily the best resource states, right? These are just three that I've chosen that I see as kind of symbolic or relevant to our progression in healing, right? So as we heal, right, when we're kind of less resourced and unhealed, we will tend to cope and gravitate towards pleasure, right? So let me be clear. Does that mean when you are more healed that you won't have a relationship to pleasure any longer? No. I think, in fact, the more resourced we get, the more pleasurable life becomes overall. But we do become perhaps a little more, because we're not starving, we're not hungry for pleasure, we're more relaxed about it. We're more generous with sharing pleasure or giving pleasure to others. We are not in scarcity of it. It's just a part of our lived experience. But generally speaking, when we're under resourced, we will reach for pleasure first. I think that's the mistake that most people make. What we should be going for is nourishment. And again, this is what you learn in the Secure Self-Relating course, is how to nourish yourself, how to regulate your own nervous system and psychospiritually nourish yourself, and how to psychospiritually nourish others. It's not really a focus in the self course. That's something that we'll be doing more at a later course for secure relating interpersonally, but you do get the basics of it in the current course that I'm launching. But basically, if we move towards nourishment first, this will bring you into more pleasure, but this will also kind of start to resource you and start to put you more towards moving towards positivity. As you get more resourced, as you get more connected and more deeply embodied of resources within yourself, when you are fully resourced, you will tend to feel and exude and express a sense of positivity, right? And so this is what I want to show you today. I want to just get you thinking about what is your relationship to resource states and where are you along this spectrum or along this kind of process and journey. And, maybe alongside that, worthy question here, do you know how to nourish yourself psychospiritually? Do you know how to create a felt sense of connection inside your nervous system that helps you to feel safe and grounded and regulated and seen and heard and felt and resonated with and understood? This is what I want to teach you. This is a huge part of, I think, what therapy is about, what coaching is about, what personal development is about, is really about nourishing ourselves. And I think this is where our society has kind of gone off track and where we've kind of gone wrong, is that we've lost the plot, right? We've really lost the importance of, relations as a major vehicle for nourishment of ourselves psychologically and spiritually and emotionally. So this is what I want to show you for now and just get you thinking, where are you in relationship to resources? Um, just to be clear, also, I want to be clear, again, these are not the only resource states or even the major resource states. There's love, there's compassion, there's aliveness, there's playfulness, there's curiosity, and then there's even subtle resource states like persistence, like curiosity, like again, patience, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole wide array of resource states, and really this is a much more large and nuanced conversation to be had for another time. But for now, where do you fall along this line? And does this make sense to you? And does this hit home for you? Let me know. Leave a comment down below. I would love to see your comments. I always do. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below as well. And I'll see you guys in another video very soon. Take care.